Thank you everyone for coming to this talk. I often do a 9-year change talk, and this year we added kind of a little bit about the 12-year change also. And those words may be familiar to you, and you may be like, what are these things? Both of which are welcome here. So I was actually thinking about why I like to. I've been doing this 9-year change talk for many years, and I just love talking about the 9-year change. And today, I was thinking about why I like it so much. I'm already getting emotional. I'm a little tired. I have some allergies going on, so if I start to cry randomly, I'll blame it on being tired. But why, as I was preparing for today, why I like to talk about this so much. And I think the reason is because to really understand these changes in children, you cannot truly understand these changes by just looking at the physical aspects of a human being or the materialistic aspects of a human being. To truly understand what's going on with the 9-year change and the 12-year change, you have to look beyond the physical. You have to include the idea of a soul, spiritual aspect of the human being to really understand what is happening. And when you do that, and when the children recognize that you are doing that, the reflection that comes back and the receptivity that the children exude is potent, and it is something very affirming to them, and it's not spoken, but you can feel it in their actions and the way they respond to you. That is just, as an adult in a cold, hard, sometimes hard world, that kind of a gesture from young children is incredibly rewarding. And there's something there that time and time again reminds me that there is more than the physical, that the human being is so much more than a physical body, and that the human being has a soul and spiritual aspects of them. Do I know exactly what that means, what soul and spirit means? Absolutely not. But do I know that there's more, and absolutely, and that journey and that study toward what that is and what's happening in there is so fruitful. And that curiosity and that understanding, and carrying that into your relationship with children and ultimately with adults and with one another, it changes the context of relationship and allows the human being, especially these developing children, to truly grow and to blossom in a way that is unique, and I think is unique to Waldorf education and to Anthroposophy and to the spiritual view of the human being. So I think I was just thinking about why this is so precious, and as I was preparing for today, you really can't understand these changes without holding that as at least a possibility for you, that there is a soul spiritual aspect of the human being. And as you do that, you get to see. He said, don't believe me, don't take this as on faith or belief. Try it out and see what happens. And that's the wonderful thing about it. You're like, okay, what if I interact in a different way, or I carry this as part of the consciousness that I'm going into talking with my 9-year-old as they're driving me up a wall, that I carry that with me, and you see this slightly different response. And that is this affirmation, oh, there's something else here, and you want curiosity to go deeper and to look more into what that might be. And I found a hilarious quote from Rudolf Steiner. These are some of my favorite Steiner quotes that I find hilarious. I don't know if anyone else will. About this, that how if we look at the human being in this materialistic way, how it's really limiting. And we'll talk more about the skeleton as we go on here. But we get the impression that the world described by natural science, according to mineral and physical law only, is not one in which we can live as human beings of flesh and blood. Theirs is a different world altogether. That means those who look at the world just as a mineral and physical laws only. When we look with eyes opened by what he calls imaginative knowledge at the world described by modern natural science, and when we see how their picture of the world is meant to affect people today, we do not find human beings of flesh and blood there at all, we see only walking skeletons, little bone men and women, and little bone men and bone women. Theirs is a strange world indeed. It cuts through like that. It's just so, theirs is a strange world indeed. And I would hope that ours, though it may sound stranger in many ways, is actually much less strange and much more, you'll find that it reflects reality more than theirs would. Okay, so we'll go through a little bit of a few basics of anthroposophy and human development. I'll try to go as quickly. I can't do any of this without giving a little bit of this preview. We'll go through that, talk a little bit about the 9-year change. We'll talk a little bit about the 12-year change. Then we'll have some time for questions at the end. But I always like to start my 9-year change talk with a story of when I was in 3rd grade, around 9 years old. And I remember this so clearly. And Ralph Steiner often talks about the 9-year change happens at it kind of happens, that there's, at a time. He often talks about it happens at a very distinct, like they're in the 9-year change all of a sudden, it kind of happens. It could be anywhere from 8.5 to 11. It doesn't mean it's right at 9 years old, but that there's kind of a moment that you might notice, and that does happen in development. And for me, one day in 3rd grade, my teacher was Mrs. Jones. She was a large woman who picked her nose. She had a very long, I'm not making this up, she had a very long pinky fingernail, and she would pick her nose with it and then roll it around in her pinky fingernail. This is true, I'm not making this up. So we'll get to why, anyway. So she did this. She was also the teacher who said, when I said, can I go to the bathroom? And she would, I don't know, can you? May I go to the bathroom? You may. She was that teacher also. So that's my memory of this 9-year-old time. And then one day I decided that I was going to start swearing. And I went out on the playground that day. And there was you go out the back door of the school, and there's this big hill, and then a big flat playing surface, and we'd go out there and we'd play football most days. And that entire football game at recess, I swore just every swear word I'd ever heard in my life. Had no relationship to what was happening in the game whatsoever. Whatever, it didn't matter what was happening. I had no idea really what it meant. But in my memory, then it stopped. I did that one day, and that was done. And not that I don't ever swear anymore, but swearing's not like a big part of my vocabulary. And after that day, it never really was. It wasn't until then it was for a day, and then it wasn't. So that's the memory that kind of really sticks with me with that 9-year change time. And we'll talk more a little bit about later, but the fact that I remember nothing really about the physical qualities of my teachers before Mrs. Jones. My teachers, I remember their names, I remember kind of the general gesture of them, you might say, but I can see and smell and feel everything about Mrs. Jones, and that's part of the 9-year change thing. And so I can say this so I don't forget. If you haven't gone through the 9-year change, or if your child hasn't yet, a few things I'd like to say. One is you will also go through the 9 and 12-year changes with your children. So as you're being what I'm describing your children will be going through, you will be going through that as well. So pay attention to that. Why am I being moved this way? You will go through that with them. One, they will come home, in both of these, especially in the 9-year change, they will come home and they will tell you about all the terrible things that their teacher is doing. And then they will come to school and they'll tell their teacher all the terrible things you are doing. Just so you have a little context of what's happening there. That is real. So you're like, I'm going to call that teacher. And then the teacher's like, oh, yeah, so how was that movie you guys went to? Whatever it might be. So just those are things so I don't forget. So I like to put that into context. So as we find ourselves reacting in these ways that our children are, and as we find these different challenges, we can kind of have a little grace for the adults in our life and our children. So before we go any further, I do want to give a quick picture. This is all understanding these changes are based on understanding the human being as a spiritual being that also, of course, has a physical body. And so Ralph Steiner describes the 7-year phases of development. Many of us probably heard this before. At age 0 to 7, we're developing our physical bodies. Age 7 to 14, we're really working on our life body, or body of formative forces, also known as the etheric body. And then 14 to 21, we're developing our soul body, or it's also called our astral body. And then I put a couple the gesture in this 0 to 7 of teaching is the world is good, and we teach out of imitation. And then the world is beautiful, and this 7 to 14 is the guiding gesture, and we teach out of something Ralph Steiner spoke of as loving authority. And then from 14 to 21, the world is true is the gesture, and we teach out of this area more of expertise. Just these kind of gestures as we move through, as it changes. This is what Waldorf education is based on, these kind of gestures, that every phase in a human development, we're teaching to that phase of development and where the child is there, not based on some external curriculum or standards, but really where the human being is at that time. So we're going to look at kind of this chunk right in here, mostly, and then of course we're going to zoom in. But if you think about young children, kindergarten age before first grade, they're really forming their physical bodies, and they're using this body of formative forces, this etheric body, this life body, to build up. So all of their kind of life force they're building their organs and their bones, and they're building all of those things with their life forces. And then Rudolf Steiner tells us, at around age 7, when he talks about with the change of teeth, that those forces that were being used only for forming the physical body are now, he said, they're liberated. And now these forces that were once really devoted to forming the physical body can now be used for thinking. And you really see that with the teeth. I was reading an anthroposophical doctor earlier today, that the teeth are the one part of the body that doesn't regenerate at all. It can't regenerate. I mean, your teeth fall. That's why dentists are dentists. There's nothing you can do. Like I could tell you my dental story. I can't grow new teeth back. It's not happening. I lost part of a finger in a bicycle chain once, and much of that grew back. There's a chunk missing, but a lot of it grew back. And of course, there's only so far different aspects of our body can regenerate. But the teeth are they're there. And so when those first ones fall out and the new ones come in, it's a sign that these formative forces have now been liberated and could go toward thinking more. And this doctor described that in a really neat way that I hadn't really thought about before, that we can think of our thinking in the same way we think of physiological processes. That there's this kind of a mineral type of thinking, there's a watery type of thinking, there's an airy type of thinking, and there's kind of a warmth-imbued thinking. And so you can see how these physical processes are now transferred into the ability to think, and especially to memorize. And they tell a story about like a first grader who hasn't quite made through this change. If the teacher says, I'm going to tell you a story that many of you have probably already heard before, you can look around, say, a first grade room, and the ones who have not yet kind of crossed this threshold would be like, oh yes, I get to hear this story again. I get to feel all these pictures. And the ones that have crossed that threshold are like, I have to hear that story again. That you can feel, because now they're like, I want something new. They want to go out and grab the world. So that's this at age 7. It's a big change, that these forces are liberated. And these are the forces that that are working through this phase. And this is grades 1 through 8. This is really what we're working on educating, this life body so that it's healthy. And so you come to this crux. And Steiner talks about in all these 7-year phases, there's 2 and 2/3 year kind of cruxes in there. There's 7, 9, 12, 14. And there's big changes. So we're going to focus on these 2 areas. And so there's something different that's happening. It's always kind of forces are being liberated. So these forces are still not liberated. These astrally soul, these adolescent forces are not yet free yet. They're being used in the other way, but you see at these little nodes, these little glimpses of these other forces being freed. So you can see, anyone have a 9-year-old here? It's kind of a joke, yeah. I know many of you have 9-year-olds. I know you. But you can see that there's a little bit of adolescence happening at these places at 9. Does that track for you? That around, like, you're seeing a little adolescence happening? There's little glimpses, so you're seeing these little things starting to pop through, like, oh, we're freeing some of this etheric, and now these forces can start to come up. So, does anyone have a memory from their childhood that just pops into their head? First thing that pops from your childhood that you'd be willing to share a tiny bit of? Anyone? Anything that pops into you? Okay.
I mean, thinking of this, when I was 9, I became very aware of death.
Mm-hmm.
That was a huge, and it also corresponded with a parent classmate dying, which I think probably, intensified it, and some other event, but is like very vivid that I can really know about it.
Sure.
And know about it.
Yeah.
It was very much a threshold before now.
Any other first memory that pops into your head from childhood? Yeah.
In the 3rd grade, I learned how to spell pneumonia ultramicroscopic silical volcanoconiosis, and I can still do that. So there are a lot of what happened in 3rd grade, is very still concrete in my mind.
Yeah. Did you have one?
I don't know, since you were talking about ear swearing, is that I was very much a kid who didn't swear, and on the bus ride home, I got really mad. I said, sure, and I meant it. And then I was just like overcome with the emotion of having such a terrible word. But now I swear like a sailor, so.
Good. That was when you decided it was part of you. Yeah. It actually fits. Good. So sometimes I start with this question before anything, because I would say 98% of the time when I do this talk anywhere in the country, years and years, that the one memory that pops into people's heads from their entire childhood is from 9 years old. I can tell you story after story of asking random. I've done it at other social gatherings. Like, tell me something. And like, oh, I remember this and this. And they're like, how old was I? And they think back, and it was when they were around 9 years old, 3rd or 4th grade. It's uncanny how often it happens. If you hear stories about divorces, big family moves, death in the family, that kind of thing, over and over again, there would be huge changes that happen at 9 years old. So that's a little something to keep in mind. It's just one of those things that happens. So, and that again reminds me that this isn't just kind of a physiological, neurological, hormonal change. This is something bigger that is happening. Yeah.
So your comment about the divorces and like the big things happening in life, is that the parents going through the same change as the child, or is it the child just remembering or being aware of it? That stuff happens all the time.
You mean it happens all the time in children's lives?
Yeah, like there's divorces when kids are in grade 1 and grade, like in all, I would say in all of the grades.
I would say the majority happen around this age, is what my thesis.
The parents of children of this age.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're going through the change as well.
I would argue that it's that the destiny that the individual, the child, brought with them in, that there was something that they needed to gain at this pivotal time in their development as they developed into this 9-year change, into this development of their ego, that they needed to experience this kind of thrusting out from this family unit at that time. So they needed more of a stronger gesture of this 9-year change And that's why they chose the parents that they chose, who would help them go through that change that they needed in their lives at that time. That would be how I would look at that. That tends to be what happens. Some of us need bigger pushes to get into these spaces, and sometimes those are the things that happen. Is that, yeah? So it'd be interesting, if you go out there, you look at these over and over. I've looked at it a lot, and it's often happening at that time. Interesting. So getting to what's happening at that 9-year change, Ralph Steiner gives us this picture that up until around the 9-year change, the child feels themselves to be one with the world, one with their surroundings. Even though he says at age 3 is when we really start to say I a lot, we're still really a part of our world. That's why when you walk into a 1st or 2nd grade classroom, it's like one kind of pulsing thing, like, here we go, where are we going? I don't know. They're just kind of the flow, and that's why, that's what a good early 1st, 2nd grade teacher is able to do. You're not working as much with individuals, you're really working with this group that can move together. And so what happens at that 9-year change time is they're somehow thrust out of that unity with the world. And they recognize themselves for the first time as an individual in the world. And this is where that death thing comes in. They recognize, oh, I have this thing. I have a self, and I. And when we say I in anthroposophical language, it's not our ego. It's not, I call the Freudian ego. It's the higher portion of ourself, the guiding force, the kind of this really pure divine aspect of ourself. And they recognize their own individuality for the first time. And as you can imagine, that can be different for every child. That can be very scary for some. It can be really sad for some. For some, it can be even more confusing than anything else, where they might not feel any distinct sadness, or that they're just kind of disoriented often. But that they truly are thrust out of a unity with the world. And I think we all see that. And Peter Selg, this is one of the books I really recommend for the 9-year change. I Am Different from You. This Encountering the Self is another one. That there's this wonderful poem that I Am Different from You that was written by a 9-year-old that I think describes this change very well. Me, I'm myself. No one in this big world is like me. I am different from you and everyone else. I'm just plain old me. Me, I'm myself. No one's like me, and I'm not like anyone. I'm just myself, little old me. I'm not quite sure what makes me different. I suppose it's in my ways. No one's the same, especially me. Which I think is just a perfect picture of that. And it's interesting because now I have a 9-year-old. We have a 9-year-old. And I kind of joke, that I feel our son was kind of born into the 9-year change. That he, coming into the world, had this real sense of himself. He, of course, is part of the unity of our family, and he's very much in rep, but he has also had a sense of, he's kind of very critical thinker of the world. He's always been able to see the world out there in a critical way. And so I found with his 9-year change that there's almost somewhat of a comfort to it. Like, finally, everybody's like, gets what I've been talking about all these years. I mean, he still has his other thing, his saying no to us, or trying to state his individuality with us. But there was also this like, oh, finally, now I can talk to all these other people that see that there's this whole world out there, and I'm separate from that world, and I can see these things. So I think that's an interesting little picture. And that's that thing where I say where they're critical now of their teacher and they're critical of their parents. It's when they start to notice what their teacher wears. If their teacher wears the same thing every day, they start, Mr. Orphanides, you have that belt on yesterday. Where first and second grade, they wouldn't even know concept of that at all. They start to really notice that. They can be critical and that of their peers in a different way. So I guess while we're on the 9-year change, the big thing I like you families to carry with them and teachers to carry with them, that no matter how it's manifesting in your child or in the 9-year-olds that you know, for you to carry this knowing that this change is happening with them, and it is in many ways traumatic. It's a real, you can imagine they've been, and if in somewhat of a hyperbole, they've been bathing kind of in a sea of kind of spiritual oneness for 9 years. And now they're standing in kind of a cold, hard, dark world for the first time. And that may look different for every child, but if you can carry inwardly that that's what they are experiencing on this inward level, that's where that change, where you'll see your relationship with them and their ability to kind of live into themselves will start to grow and open up. That's why I put this little person on a sailboat. That's what I always think of, the ones going through the 9-year change. They're out on a boat, out on a dark sea, and like a foggy, dark sea, out by themselves, kind of bobbing in the ocean. And once in a while, they might get a glimpse of land over there. But then and ultimately we are all alone in many ways as individuals. We're on, in anthroposophical terms, we've fallen out of this spiritual world and we've landed in this base materiality that can't do half the portion of the things that our full selves could do. And as we first come to realize that, it's heavy, and it's a traumatic event. And so, again, the gesture that, if you can carry that as you're interacting with your pain-in-the-butt children that are giving you a hard time, if you can carry that inwardly, it won't necessarily change that you yell at them or you tell them to go to their room or give them consequences. That's all okay and good and healthy. But just that subtle shift within you will change and allow them to unfold in a way that is healthy for them, allow them to become what they need to become. How's that landing?
Next question.
Mhm.
So, just in like very basic terms, what do you think of as behavioral things that you typically spend the night on?
Yeah. So it depends. There is, of course, the stating their individuality. Like I'm doing this. Like our son does that now definitely for the first time. Like, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
We're like, excuse me? Yeah, as a teacher of elementary school students for a long time, like, young man. Yeah, and that's where my experience is in that, whereas I'm talking about my family, my wife is right here, is an early childhood educator, and that's a different gesture when you're working with children up to around 7, 8 even, but at 9 is kind of where I'm like, no. So that, saying, no, I'm not going to do that. You get that a little around 3 where they say no, but they don't really know what no means. They're like, no, and then they do the thing. But they got to say that. That's like that little glimpse of it at 3. But 9, it becomes no, and they're standing there, and you're like, brush your teeth. They're like, I'm not going to brush my teeth. Yes, you are. Right, so that's one thing. I think some of the, like you pointed to, some of the kind of teenagery things, like now I'm going to do my hair, or I'm going to pay attention to my clothes in a different way or something. Yeah.
I would even add, like, there's this realization of, oh, I can get sick, or oh, I can, like, anything can happen to me.
Right.
And it probably exists.
Sure. Yeah.
So carefree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a sense of their own fragility and their own, and that's, say, with a more melancholic child, you might get more of that they're in the office a lot more, that they're like, oh, my stomach hurt, I hurt my arm, really hurt it. Well, your arm's okay. So those are some of the things, how their relationships to, well, again, that being very critical of adults especially, because they see in the adults sometimes the fallen aspects of what it means to be an individual. And like, I don't want that. I don't, like, that thing, I don't want that part. So they can get very critical of that. So I think those are things, their relationships with their peers start to change. And that can look, I think, in a lot of different ways. I rarely see them more critical of their peers, however. They're kind of more like, are you with me? Are you with me? I need friends in here. I need a crew. They're critical of the adults, but they're not so critical of the peers. But they're more thoughtful about friendships. Those are some things I can see. Some more will maybe come up. Any other questions right now about the 9-year change? Yeah?
So, what are things as parents we can do to help them navigate this and help ourselves at the same time?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that always comes. And again, like I wrote down as I was preparing for this, what can we do? ? And I wrote, pay attention. It's really, that's why I start with that, as the biggest thing you can do is know that this is happening within them. So I can't say that enough, because for me that's the biggest thing, is what you do inwardly is the biggest thing, most important thing you can do to serve the children in their unfolding. So where is your compassion inwardly for what they're going through? And from that place, then you can continue to lay these loving, firm boundaries. I will stand by that. They are like, they will push, because they're like, I'm a free bird now. I'm an individual. I'm going to go out against everything. And you, in a very loving way, holding this gesture, I understand that what you're going through, or and here's the boundary. And it's really a clear, firm boundary. So that's my biggest thing, is continuing to hold those in a very loving way. But if you do that without this inner why I say that second, if you do that without this inner understanding of the traumatic event that they're going through inwardly, then it's not going to work. It's going to become a conflict, because now they have this this ego, that has the ability to go against your ego, which never works out well in any relationship. So that's why you have to really hold this and then put that boundary, because you do still have to be the ego presence there. But without that inner sense, then it's just kind of bumping against them. The other thing Steiner talks about is attending to their physical well-being during all the time, but during this time. Are they eating well? Are they sleeping well? Are they exercising? Because it's this physical body that they have to, as a spiritual being, move into and be able to inhabit in a healthy way. So that's the other piece that Steiner gives as a really, it's funny how why I love Steiner, though. He gives this whole spiritual picture, but then we also have to attend to the physical, and spirit is matter, and matter is the spirit. It's not like you can deny that there's a physical body and be like, oh, we'll just attend to their spiritual qualities. We have to really nurture their physicality so that this burgeoning, this free individuality can have muscles and bones and blood and things to get into and inhabit in a healthy way. Does that make sense? Yeah. Those, I would say, would be the biggest things. I always, as a movement teacher, the games teacher, I always bring competition for the first time in 3rd grade, really, and I bring it really consciously, because this is when they first have that sense of I, and if you're not bringing it in a conscious way, then there's like, and they go and clash against each other, because they really have to feel, what does this mean to be an individual? So that's why kind of competitive sports in the Waldorf school, we rather families didn't do competitive sports until later on, until around the 12-year change, because they have they're individuals for the first time, so they are very bad at competing, because they don't even know what the me versus the other is. So, but if you are doing that, it can also be very healthy if you can really be guiding them through that process of now, how did that go? Like when I introduce competitive games, I stop the game every 3 or 4 minutes. Like, oh, everybody stop, come on in. What are we here? Because they're fighting within 3 or 4 minutes. And so I say, what happened there? Oh, yeah, this, did that work? No, that didn't work for you. And then back to the game. And we do that, but I do it regularly, just continually bring them back because they're terrible competitors. And that's that sign of like, they don't know what it means to be an individual yet. But we can help them. So sport and activity can be, if it's held in the right way, can be a really good way to help nurture them through this change. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Is it okay to be curious with them, like to ask them questions as they're going through this change?
So to be curious, absolutely. How you address that curiosity, I would say, is where you have to be careful. They don't have an intellectual understanding of what they're going through. Both these changes, the 9 and 12-year change, are very inward changes. So that curiosity can be maybe perhaps, that's why that curiosity is more of an inner gesture. We don't want to intellectualize, kind of like, how are you feeling? Because they don't really know how. They could tell you a whole bunch of stuff, but it really doesn't have any grounding because it hasn't been educated. That part of them hasn't been educated. So a curious posture, a curious gesture, like, I'm not doing that. Okay, is there something else that will help you to brush your teeth right now? Like that kind of a curiosity perhaps, but not, oh, why don't you want to brush your teeth? That kind. Does that make sense, that nuance a little bit there? I think that we have to be careful of that when we intellectualize our curiosity versus this curious gesture within us. Like, yes, that's hard, or whatever it is. But that gesture more inwardly and less intellectually. Does that make sense?
So you're saying they won't even understand the feelings that they're going through? Like if I say, tell me how you're feeling and how I can help, or...
I say that the relationship between their feelings and their cognitive understanding of their feelings is not formed yet. They understand that they're feeling, but as far as articulating that into a thought or into language is not quite there. So it's tricky. This is not easy. Like 9 to 14 is hard. 9 to 16, I'd say especially, is probably the hardest. Like, it's hard. It's confusing because they don't have many capacities yet. So we as adults, we're like, talk to me about that. Tell me about that so I can help you. And they're like, oh, I don't know. But those feelings are real. So that's where that curiosity, like knowing that they're pissed or they're elated, or those are real feelings. But it doesn't have a cognitive relationship yet to that. That's a very adulty thing that we start to do after around age 14. So the feelings are real, but then the concept that goes along with the feeling is not yet developed. It's tricky. It is. It's nuanced. Yeah.
Could it give them a sense of a feeling of emptiness? Like,
Yes.
Because like Madeline has been saying, I just feel like this empty feeling. And that she could say that, but like where it's coming from, obviously she has no idea.
Yeah, and being open to them sharing that is great. I guess my warning, caution would be, we don't want to limit those feelings to what their immature cognizing capacities are able to put on that. Because there's so much going on. She's feeling empty and full and sad and angry and happy, and if we put it in, like, tell me what that is, then I feel we could be limiting the real complexity of what they're experiencing, which is a huge, tremendously complex experience. So that would be where my caution would be. We don't want to limit it. We want to allow it to be open and expressed in the way it needs to be, in all of its complexity and messiness. Did you have?
We've been advice from somewhere else, but it seemed like it fits, but also I'm not sure in terms of the word intellectualizing. So when Maddie is struggling with, I don't know what I'm doing in this situation, but ask her, well, what would other children do? What would somebody else do? And so-and-so would lie. How how do you think that would go? And I don't think I like it. Okay, great, what's enough to do? And that feels like an individualizing, like comparing and contrasting in this peer group sense, but is that also too intellectualizing in that space? Seems like it fits or doesn't.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I would say it could go either way.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think, I would say another potent way to do a similar thing is through story, through archetype. That's why in the second grade we bring these stories of the saints, modern day saints and ancient saints. And then in third grade we have these archetypal stories of people wrestling with individuality. That's why we do the Hebrew stories in third grade. This first of human beings seeing God, like feeling they can talk to God, like Job talks to God, which is just a crazy idea. That we just like, oh, that's Job, but really? A human talking to God? What are you talking about? It's weird. But that's that third grade experience. So I'd say story is a way to do that, to without limiting it, to keep it in this archetypal realm. What about this story that you heard about this saint or this person or something we studied or a person, Jackie Robinson, or, this is when, I remember it very clear when I was this age and our sons were reading a lot of biographies. Like Ben Franklin, all of a sudden, is like this whole thing at 9 years old, what, who? And then so you can use archetypal stories that really give a picture that's less, because we want to leave those open as big as we can for the complexity and not limit it in the best we can. Yeah. Okay, so I have this wonderful drawing here. We're going to move toward the 12-year change a little bit. This is a drawing Rudolf Steiner gave of the human being. It's one of my favorite drawings. I'll talk about the dragon in a minute. So the head is this really round thing, very solid on the outside. And the center of the head, Rudolf Steiner talks about, is right in the middle of the kind of physical head. And then the torso he talks about is this moon shape, this kind of the spiritual torso, and actually extends way out in front of us. And so the center of the torso, which is the heart and the breathing apparatus, is way out somewhere in front of us. And then the limbs, Steiner talks about in this description, are injected into us from the infinite periphery. Just a wonderful picture. And the reason I give that, so these are the forces, there's a lot of these forces that are forming kind of the body, and then they can go up to the head and be liberated around this 7-year change, and they can help with thinking. But then it's this torso, which is all about rhythmic pulse, breathing, is what we really educate during this time. And then the limbs, the metabolic, and the will, it works through the limbs and the metabolic system. So Steiner gives these fascinating pictures of what's happening at the 12-year change. And he says, before the 12-year change, this is where the soul spiritual part comes out. And this is why I kind of was crunching this down before tonight's talk. Steiner tells us that our brain does not do the thinking. Our brain is not it doesn't actually do the thinking. Our brain is a reflective organism that reflects the thinking that's happening with our soul and our spiritual aspects of us. And our brain is the most precise reflective organism ever created. And it reflects all of this activity that's going on in the spiritual world through thinking. And he tells us that the thinking before the 9-year change, especially from around 7 to 12, before the 12-year change, between 7 and 12, comes from the muscles and the blood in the muscles. That there's this wisdom living in the kind of spiritual being in the muscle, in the blood and the muscles, and then that is kind of what drives the thinking. And that's why our curriculum from those early years, say 7 to 9, 7 to 10, 11, we do the animal and human being in 4th grade. We do the plant world, that there's this element with the human being and the plant rooted. But then at age 12, he says the thinking starts to originate in the skeleton. I don't know. But I'm going to put that out there. Do I know? I obviously, but these are kind of why I love to play with these ideas. Like, what the F is he talking about? The thinking drives in the skeleton. But that's when, for the first time, they can actually understand the natural world and the physical, natural laws of the world, which is when our curriculum, we start our physics, we start our chemistry, we do mineralogy, we start with Rome, this very physical landing. So it's the first time they actually have this capacity. And then we do this physics, like the laws of physics. So he says, in order to truly think about the inorganic world, the physical world, that you have to think with your skeleton. Or you do think with your skeleton anytime you're thinking about the inorganic world. What exactly that means, I don't know. But if anyone has watched a 12-year-old, this is one of their favorite things to do. Look on these things on any hallway in here, and they're covered with hand marks. Something is happening in the bones. So I like to introduce club juggling in the movement activity. And I was taught in my movement training that those clubs, juggling in 6th grade, is kind of a picture of the bones. Because if you see the way a club moves when you're juggling, ever know what I mean, club juggling? The way it moves is very much like an arm or an appendage or a body. So as they're learning to juggle these clubs, they're feeling their bones in a different way, and it really meets the 6th grader, 6th, 7th grader in this way. Because there's something has shifted into their bony structure. And that's, I mean, you can see it if you think about a 6th, 7th grader. They're like all limbs. It's like a huge skeleton. It is like a skeleton walking down the hallway, and you watch them, they bump in there. And they don't know. They're like, is that my hand? Like, how did that get way out there? They have no sense of that. So that's kind of one of those things where Steiner gives me these ideas about, I don't know how I'm thinking with my skeleton at age 12, but I can certainly see there's some relationship that changes in the human being that is more skeletal. And what is fun to think about when we think in terms of the skeleton, and I started to really think about this, I had plantar fasciitis when I was about 12 years ago, really bad, and I couldn't run, I couldn't do anything, and someone said, you gotta get into barefoot running. And so that was when that book had just come out, what's it called? Born to Run, thank you. And I went all the way in, I was like, yes, and it totally cured my plantar fasciitis. I still wear nothing but barefoot shoes. Then you read about what's going on in your foot and the physics that's happening in the human foot, like the amount of bones. I can't remember. I always forget, and I'm not good at. It's like 27 bones, 10,000 nerves. Is that?
It's 27 bones, and if you do a factor of joints, you have over 1,000 joints in the foot by all the different aspects of the anatomy.
Just in the foot. And then the nerve ending, there's 20,000, I don't want to, an inordinate amount of. I did not plant her here for this. But and then you think about this, why barefoot shoes are, I won't go too far into this, but I've got to do this for the wisdom of the skeleton. If you think about the flex in the arch and the splay of the toes that the human being is made to do, there's this natural spring that if you ask like a human being to develop an arch that was able to, in a mechanism that was able, there's no way we in all of our science and wisdom could create something as complex as the human skeleton. And esoterically, Rose Steiner would tell us that the skeleton is the oldest part of the human being. When I talk about oldest, I'm talking about when the human being developed eons and eons ago, the skeleton was the first thing that was developed. So the rest of us is kind of still like our liver is kind of like, I'm getting there, I'm kind of work, but I'll get better eventually. Our skeleton is finished. It's perfect from a spiritual and philosophical point of view. And so if you think of the wisdom that exists in our skeleton, it's kind of mind-blowing. Like, who did that? Who built this foot? So there's something there as you approach that, thinking about this 12-year-old living and thinking out of their skeleton. There's an incredible wisdom that lives in the human body and really lives especially in the skeleton. And then the other thing Rose Steiner tells us about the 12-year change is that first time they can understand cause and effect. My joke of that, I've yet to meet a 12-year-old that can understand cause and effect. But the capacity is there, and they will get there for the first time, which is why our education educates cause and effect. It's like, see, when we shut the lights off, it gets very dark. You know, it's just things like that that seem very basic, but they're starting to understand that. Our sciences get really into that. So for the first time at age 12, they can see that. And I like to think, so the 9-year change, I guess is kind of my other little, 9-year change is pretty noticeable. I think why most people here have 9-year-olds or around that age. And not a lot of people with 12-year-olds come to these talks. Because I would argue that the 12-year-old change goes, if 9-year change is a very inward one, I would say the 12-year change is even deeper inward. And you really won't see many of the manifestations of the 12-year change until they're 13 and 14. And then you'd be like, why are they doing that? And I will argue that that's what 7th graders are doing right now, right, Olivia? What 7th Olivia's works in the 7th grade right now. That's a result of these changes that happened within them in the 12-year, more in that 6th grade gesture. It's very subtle, but it's very deep. And again, to that inward gesture as we're holding our 12-year-olds going through this, and they are spazzy. I do archery with the 6th grade right now. 6th grade is spazzy right now. They are wild right now. The spring of 6th grade, something has, but they don't know. I always say it's like neurologically, it's one of the messiest times in human development. What's happening, the amount of pruning that's happening in their brains, it's like a soup, like a pea soup. Like the myelination is all gone. They're like starting to form new patterns. But they don't know it, and you're just like, what is happening? But there's also a very deep and subtle change happening in their soul life, and new capacities really being born in them. And it's not as traumatic, I would say, as the 9-year change, but it is equally as dramatic. And you'll see it more when they're 13 and 14, what was going on at that age. But if you can know when they're 12 that stuff is happening, and you can pay attention to that, I think that would be very fruitful for your child's unfolding at that time. So at 12 years old, they can actually experience, you could say they can experience the forces of the natural world, which is a pretty cool thing when they see, like if you look at, when they see, say, a lever, like a hand truck is a good example, they can actually experience that in their bodies in a way. And that's, again, to what can we do at that, helping them get into their physical bodies in that way will be really nurturing for them, as through their bodies they can understand the changes that are happening in their soul life, if that makes sense. Ralph Steiner talked about this, both the 9-year change and the 12-year change, as crossing the Rubicon. He talked about both of them as Rubicon crossings, and the Rubicon is for those that don't know, the river that Julius Caesar crossed. And the people warned him that don't cross. He was up in northern Italy and he was coming back down. They're like, don't you dare come back to Rome, because they knew if Caesar came back to Rome, everybody would be like, he's the best, we love Julius Caesar. And that he would become the emperor, so like, don't you dare cross the Rubicon. If you cross the Rubicon and come down toward Rome, then we're going to attack you. And that was this destiny moment for Julius Caesar. And apparently there was this flight of eagles that came, augury of birds. And he crossed the Rubicon, which they say is a very small river. So. But they say that's why Rubicon's a very small river, but it's a very big gesture. So you can think about these changes that happen at that 9-year change. There's really no going back. We've left childhood in a way, an aspect of childhood. And that's behind us, and how do we move forward? And that's that murky 9 to 12. You have this beautiful balance happening there, age 10, 11, and you hit 12 again, you cross another one, and then again, that's behind you. And there's not a going back, and there's a longing to go back always. We probably all still experience it. There'll be a longing, and that's part of that sadness or that emptiness. That's that longing to go back, but there's not a going back, and they're very aware of that. And that's also very exciting, though, because there's this unfolding happening, but it can be challenging. Are you all excited for 9, 10, 11, 12? I always go back to story, and I always give people the confidence, if you just start like a therapeutic pedagogical story, and you have no idea where it's going, it will still be okay. Because it's hard. If you don't want to intellectualize them, you don't want to give them this intellectualized abstract concept of skin color and socio-political economics and what have you. Story is the thing that you can always turn to. And there's not always good stories that you know, or that like, oh, let me read, oh, I got the perfect book. It's not always there. But I tell teachers this too, that trust in your ability to tell the right story at the right time. Whether it's from your own biography or something you really make up on the spot. Like, well, you know, once upon a time, there were these lions. That's how I often start my stories, with lions. But and you see it, and all of a sudden these characters, but you also, these characters start to grow as you're like slowly telling a story. You can see things just, and it can be a fun thing. And it doesn't need to be long or complex. That's the best remedy I know of before we're able to talk to them in a way, if we're trying not to do the intellectual. Because the more that we can bring things in to a realm that's bigger than any individual, whether it's working with adults or with children, then the more effective that can be, I think. Because, yeah, I mean, that's what the world is doing, so that's why I think Waldorf education, maybe not necessarily what they get through the minutia, but what they get through the big gesture of Waldorf education, through the stories that they hear regularly, through the knitting world that they go into, through these different aspects of the curriculum, that they're nurtured in this way, and they have a certain resilience, that some of the minutia that might be less effective for younger children, you might say, isn't as harmful in that way. I'd love to give people the ability to tell stories when you don't even know what that story is going to be. When you're faced with a question of like, I don't know how to deal with this. Start a story. It's fun. It's fun. Especially when you don't know what's going to happen. It's time for bed. Yeah, and then your presence alone also, I think, goes so far in the way you're holding yourself in that moment. And your clarity of the way you can kind of say a few words to move through something that can be really challenging. I think that also goes a long way. Yeah, that's confusing. I don't know about that. That's hard. But you're holding, it's not just like dismissive, you know, but you're really holding, like that is confusing. But you're holding a comfort and a knowing and a loving knowing in that. I think that also goes a long way. Sometimes we can't. Like with an 8, 7-year-old, I'm not going to. You know why? You know that's a very materialistic view of the human being. Skin color. In fact, it's just a social construct, really. I mean, back in the 1500s in Portugal, we can't do that. So this thing, what we talk about, why I talk about that so much, what we do inwardly is why I tell all the teachers, that is the thing they are learning from. Everything else is just sugarcoating. It's what are we doing? Who are we? How are we turning ourselves inwardly? That's the thing that they're paying attention to. How are you walking through the house? All those things, that's really I'll put my money on that every time. And then what comes out is the right thing. And you all have all the answers. I can talk about a lot of things, but you have all been chosen by your children for really great reasons. And they've come to you because you know just what they need to get through these challenging times. And we can offer ideas and thoughts on what's happening, but you really have the wisdom to do the right things.